Tansi, Sego, Wayne Bojo, Makwagish Gaden Dishnaka, Shikan Dodem, Kugan Dunchba, Miwa German, English, and Dao. My spirit name is Sun Bear. I am Cayugan from the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, or people of the Longhouse, and I am also German and English. So in a thought, I'm walking inclusion. I'm three different sets of ancestors from different parts of the world. I wanted to welcome everybody today in a good way and bring us together one mind. To start that off, I'm going to use a ceremony that many Indigenous people here in Turtle Island use and light a bit of sage. The smoke from that is used for purifying mind, body, and spirit. And part of the ceremony, and some of the ceremonies where we wash our hands spiritually in that smoke, take some over our eyes, our ears, our heart, our mind, our body, and bring ourselves into focus, leave negativity outside of this circle. And by doing so, we're telling ourselves one thing. We're telling all of ourselves something, that everything we touch, we're going to touch with our hearts. We're going to speak from our hearts. We're going to look at things with our hearts. We're going to think with our hearts. And very importantly, we're going to listen to one another with our hearts. I think when everything goes through that filter, the good things will be kept and the negative things will be left behind. So when we do this, that idea of sitting in a circle together, that old style of looking in at the fire burning in the center, that we all have a different point of view and see things differently from our points in the circle. And we combine all those things, when we speak those things and share that knowledge and wisdom together, we all gain, we're all gifted. And when we receive gifts like that, to put them in our heart and carry them to others to share and learn and listen from. So all these things coming together, all these ideals, the concept of inclusion, to me, which talks about being intercultural. Intercultural says a dialogue between. When we have a dialogue between people, we eliminate silos. We dissipate those imaginary borders. We come together and build relationships. We form allies. We form a bond between one another. And that only leads to more sharing, more caring, more understanding. So I wanted to welcome everybody in that way in this brief little ceremony and say that while you're here, listen to each other with your hearts. Share with your hearts. Store things in your hearts. Take them back and share them with others. And enjoy this time together because it's unique. It's special. So, miigwech for listening to me.
Hello, everybody. I'm Genaro Lozano. I'm in Mexico City, and I'm really happy to be back at 6 Degrees. Last year, we had a terrific conversation for the first time in Latin America of 6 Degrees in my city. And this year, of course, we're having a new kind of conversation digitally because, of course, what's happening in the world. And I'm really happy to be part of this global family of 6 Degrees. Today, we'll be talking with a group of very interesting people, activists, people who have produced and worked for change in their own communities and countries. And I'm really happy to be joined by Roberta Jamison. She's from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, Canada. She's president and CEO of Inspire, Canada's largest indigenous charity, the first First Nation woman in Canada to earn a law degree, the first woman ombudsman or ombudswoman of Ontario, and the first woman elected chief of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Hello, how are you?
Sego, I am fine and happy to join you from my home community.
I'm so happy to meet you. Welcome to 6 Degrees.
Thank you.
I'm joined by Rob Johnson as well. He's in the United States. He's president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. He recently served on the United Nations Commission of Experts on International Monetary Reform, and previously was a managing director at Soros Fund Management and Bankers Trust Company. How are you, Rob?
Doing well, thank you.
Welcome back to 6 Degrees.
My pleasure.
We're joined by Serpil Midyatli, chairwoman of the Social Democrats and member of Parliament of Schleswig-Holstein. Germany of Turkish descent. She was the first Muslim to be elected to the state parliament in 2009. And we also joined by Ijoma Oluo. She's in Seattle. She's a writer, speaker, and internet yeller. Her best-selling book, So You Want to Talk About Race, and her writing in publications around the world has made her of one of the U.S. most sought-after voices on race relations. How are you, Yoma?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
I'm so excited to meet you all. We'll be having first conversation, a few minutes of talk with Roberta and Ijoma, and then Serpil and Rob will join us in a few minutes again. Of course, we're seeing a lot of things happening in the world right now, and I think that with the turn of the century, we're starting to see maybe the beginning of a new era. I'm not sure if that would be the correct term to put it, but we've seen a lot of things happening in the world, no? The global war on terror, and then movements in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, a new rise of the feminist movement, LGBTQ activism everywhere, racial justice, climate change, and so on. And of course, we're facing right now a global sanitary health crisis, the pandemic that is hitting the world in different ways. But I wanted to start this conversation, Ijoma, by thinking of what's coming next, of a future in which maybe after this pandemic goes away, or maybe after we find a cure for it, we start to talk about the urgency of constructing a new world. How do you envision that? What's your ideal of the future that comes after what we're facing now?
I think it's really important to recognize that right now there are protesters out in the street. We're in the middle of an uprising that's really asking for new systems. That's asking for the destruction of systems that have been harming BIPOC populations for hundreds of years. And so where I am excited is that we, in many ways, are moving past the discussion of can these horrifically oppressive systems be changed and altered in a way to make them slightly less violent and oppressive, to can we build something better? I cannot, of course, perfectly envision what liberation would look like because we are all shaped by our times. So what I am fighting for right now is shaped by an oppressive viewpoint. And the future generations will pick up on what we're doing now and move that ahead. But I will say that I know we can't get to a free society with our prison industrial complex still standing. And we can't with exploitative capitalism still running. So we are looking at, really massive change around economic systems, around how we view punishment and rehabilitation, mental health services. We would need to have universal health care around the country. We would need to reframe education from an anti-colonialist perspective. And so, it really looks like valuing people, and it looks like valuing people enough to deconstruct systems that are doing harm and rebuild things that show that, we see each individual, we see cultures, and that everyone has the right to shape the society around them, not just those in power.
Roberta, your turn. How do you envision, what do you think of a radical future? What would be Roberta's dream about what's coming next?
Well, I have to say I'm very excited at the prospect of building a different world in the future. At a time of crisis, people are down, and what we see are rising expectations as a result. If you look at history, the Vietnam War, the rise of individual rights recognition, following that, the rise of feminism, LGBTQ rights, here in Canada, the rights of many different populations, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, these all came out of a dark period, I think. We're in yet another one. So I'm very excited at the prospect of creating a new future, and a future that I believe and am determined to see includes Indigenous peoples around the world. Not as one of the group, but as people, as Indigenous people with particular values and solutions and approaches that the world can benefit from. So I want a future that will embrace us. Our people believe we're responsible today in our decisions for the seventh generation whose faces we can still see coming towards us. This is not a romantic notion. This is a very real,
achievable,
and a yardstick that, let me tell you, over the years that I was chief in my community, I had to look in the mirror every day and say, what am I doing today to make the life of the seventh generation a better one? But I think we don't think this way today in society.
Mhm.
We're very zero-sum. We're very polarized. So one thing that has to change if we're going to create a future together is to start identifying the shared goals. And I think out of a time of fear, which we're in today, comes an opportunity to pull together to build a future where we all can thrive and be healthy and see ourselves surviving in the future together.
Sure. I see a common concern in both of you, and that is the fact that change needs to be produced through decades. We have seen the Black liberation movement in the U.S. Starting back in the 18th century, and of course a new wave in the 20th century, and today we're seeing a new one, no? And of course, racial inequality is still there. It's still producing a lot of pain, still producing a lot of inequality. Is it also because of our expectations grow every year more, and we're not finding this change as fast as we want? How do we get there? How do we manage to fulfill our rising expectations with the change we need to get? How would you start to that conversation, Roberta?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that what we've done thus far is deal with some of the legal apparatus around discrimination. That was pretty low-hanging fruit. What we have not done is put in place effective structures to hold ourselves accountable. Structures that people can believe in, that are outside the box. And at the moment, we have really a crisis in confidence and trust in the society, in our structures, whether it's national structures or even in more recent times, international structures. And so I think we've got to start embracing the real challenge that's there. We need new structures. So real tangible goals are important. Incremental change is vital. But we've got to be moving towards the destination where we want to get to and measuring ourselves. That will keep the people in believing change is possible, and that will keep society accountable for the change. So those are some of the key first steps I see.
I mean, I would say that people have been fed up for a very, very long time. You know, we have multiple generations of activism, people who gave their entire lives saying that we need change. What I would love to see if we're looking at, you know, creating real change that's going to drastically impact the lives of people in this world is we're going to need to see where our systems are tied to white male supremacy and really divorce our systems from that and replace it with something more collective. The truth is right now that people still get their sense of security, they get their money, their political power from these exploitative systems. And as long as that is where people get what they need or feel they get what they need, they're going to feel threatened by any efforts to uproot that. So even when we're looking at issues like policing, right, we're looking at a huge financial system with the prison industrial complex, but we're also looking at our collective idea of safety that is filled with a lot of racist patriarchal ideas. And so the work has to happen twofold, where we have to divorce our city budgets, our local budgets, our money making from these enterprises, but we also have to reframe what we think safety is. Is safety where we lock entire populations away, or is safety where we provide services for, you know, culturally relevant services for communities, right? And so it's a twofold process that needs to happen, but we can't do one without the other. And I find often we like to live in the hearts and minds section where we just spend time saying, recognize that we're people, recognize that everything could be great, without addressing the fact that you may love someone, but your money, how you pay your bills and feed your family depends on the continued exploitation of that person. And until we can do both, where we recognize it and then divorce it and replace it with something else that is more holistic, that is more collaborative, we're going to be stuck with these harmful systems.
Let's bring the conversation, Rob and Serpil. We'll be back with you both in a little bit. Let's hear the other people who are joining us in this conversation for 6 Degrees. Now I'd like to hear from you both on your vision of a radical future after all this happens, after all what we are facing in the world right now ends. How do we get there? And what's your idea? What's your dream of a radical future? And I'll start with you, Serpil.
We have now many things to do with the pandemic in Germany, and in the government we take some way for solutions, and we see that we have not the answer for all the things we had. For example, our system doesn't work in these difficult times, where hospitals in Germany that no longer had to necessary cancer drugs, for example.
The same is happening in Mexico.
Mexico too, okay.
Yeah, for kids with cancer also.
Yeah, and went to a hospital and found out, and they said we have a problems because the container ships from out there, they don't come to Europe. And so we must change our systems because the market can't solve every problem.
But Rob, Serpil is saying that the market cannot solve all of these problems. And as in the previous conversation, we were also having kind of a discussion about what needs to change. And one of the things in which both Roberta and Ijoma agreed was on the need for changing the capitalist system. What's your perspective? What's your dream of a radical future?
Well, I would start with the pillar of Dr. Martin Luther King. In his later years, Vincent Harding wrote a wonderful book called The Inconvenient Hero, where King, in his last 3 years of his life, emphasized militarism, materialism, and racism as the 3 demons. Racism could be broadened to otherness of all different forms to incorporate many of the polarities and prejudices we see today. But the other dimension of this, which Dr. King did a lot of work on, like his 1967 speech on the universal basic income, was very prescient. And what Dr. King and others emphasized is that a market is just a tool. It's not a deity. It's not a God. It's not an arbiter of right and wrong. And that the psychology of otherness is now in a place where we all live in a haunted house. But otherness is in contrast to humanity. When you get to accepting otherness, you live in a haunted house because your subconscious begins to recognize that they could change the definition of otherness and you might be the other. And while that doesn't, there are elites and there are in kind of tribal formation that perhaps are somewhat insulated from that, anyone who is sensitive can see that the degradation of humanity could be turned on them. I'm saying this at the level of unconscious, not conscious deliberation. So the moral legitimacy of the society we have, the substitution of markets for values, the pretending that these icy things that create preferences and demand functions in economics translate into something that the arbiter called the market solves our problems are nonsense. Serpil mentioned, and you reinforced the notion of what they call externalities, spillovers, cancer, people living in and around Long Beach Harbor in California suffering because of the diesel exhaust from the shipping companies. There's so many dimensions and so much what you might call pervasiveness of what we would call market failures, that the notion, the backbone of this ideology is like a special case that doesn't and never exists and is not in proportion with the vision and the goals that we need. And I'll finish by setting up with a wonderful philosopher, Wittgenstein's student, Stephen Toulmin, wrote a book called Cosmopolis. And he looked at the 30 Years' War and the beginning of the Cartesian Enlightenment and how it was transferred in its methods. These fault lines were recognized. But the challenge was when you would hit a crisis and everyone becomes afraid, they would often lurch back to the familiar rather than forward to a new vision.
Sure.
Many people say the 1960s, with the civil rights movement and many lifestyle changes in the anti-war movement, was a threat, and the Reagan era, we'll call it Reagan-Thatcher era, was a counter-revolution. It was a lurch backward. Well, I think we're now at a terrifying place. We can see what's wrong, but how can we together re-envision a humanity and support each other in moving forward?
I totally agree with you, Rob. And let me get back to Serpil, because I think that at least, if I'm not wrong, you found a way to change that. You ran for office. You were working at the restaurant and then suddenly said, I want to get involved. I want to produce change. I want to end things the way they are. And you ran for office and you successfully got to it. But one thing that Rob mentioned was otherness. And I love the fact that you brought that up, because otherness is one of fear of otherness, the fear of immigration, the fear of people from the xenophobia. How do we address that fear of migrants that will to build walls instead of bridges, that problem that we are facing in Europe, but also in North America, but also in Southeast Asia and many other parts of the world? What would you do about it, Serpil? How would you produce change? What would be your preferred strategies for that?
First, I will say that I'm a supporter to working inside the structures. I know that we have, for example, migration self-organization, that's very, very important. But if you want to change the system, you must be a part of it. And if you be a part of it, you can make a change. I know it is not easy, and it's a hard way to grow up in the system, but it's easier because you can use the structures. Not all the structures are bad in the system, and you can be a part of the system, and you can use the structures to change them. And most of the important thing, I think, it's in Germany, for example, many years, like 40 years, the German community talk not with us, they talk about us. And if you be in the system and you have a place at the table, they must talk with us, and they must talk and look at my eyes and say, that way you go, it's not good. It's easier to talk with the people if they are out of the box, but it's not so easy to look at my eyes and say, Serpil, you can't do that.
Sure. Before bringing Roberta and Roma into the conversation, let me go back to Rob, because Rob, Serpil believes in changing the system from within. And you have been part of that as well. You have worked at the US Senate, you have worked at banking institutions, but the system is really resilient and is really conservative in a way that it doesn't want to change.
I grew up as a skeptic because I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, which was a cauldron. Labor management fights. One of my Little League baseball coaches was blown up in an airplane with Walter Reuther. I lived through the '67 riots. Dr. King spoke at the place I was going to high school 4 years later, 21 days before he died, on March 15th. My parents talked as he was killed about evacuating our house. So I didn't grow up in what economists might call an equilibrium.
Mm.
That was like assuming a happy ending. And in the context of my life, I was able to, how do they say, work with elite institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But I had inside myself not to want them, not to agree, but to use my presence in ways that are often refuted and frustrated. I wouldn't call them resilient, I'd call them resistant.
Resilience, yeah.
They're often very brittle, but they're very resistant up until the time things break. But I did work with people like Charles Kindleberger, manias, panics, and crashes. He was not deifying financial markets. George Soros has a very challenging perspective because he grew up in the turmoil of Nazi-invaded Hungary. And so I think there's a moment of frustration that pierces through me over and over again, where I just want to jump outside. But I also want to be a channel of the outside to the inside. And but you're right. Your challenge that you present to me is that there are many people who think their bread is buttered or their career is enhanced or by not changing, even when the hideousness is hiding in plain sight.
First, I just want to talk a little bit
Sure.
to what's been discussed here about whether or not we do work in or outside of systems. And I'm going to first quote Audre Lorde in "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." It is really important that we remember that while there is, of course, some work necessary in these powerful systems, that we do not attach ourselves to systems that for hundreds of years have shown that they depend on the violent exploitation of vulnerable populations. The truth is that these systems will continuously fight change. And in the United States, we're seeing this right now. We're seeing a threat to our, ability to even hold an election because we are so wed to the idea of disenfranchising certain populations of voters. So it's important to recognize that yes, these powerful systems, some people have to work within, but if you find yourself wedded to those systems or thinking those systems can actually be saved, chances are you're not on the right side of history, because for hundreds of years, those systems have proven that they cannot. And so we have to do both. There always has to be people outside of the system pushing for something new and better. Systems built off of the blood of exploitation cannot be saved. We can do what we can within them while they are powerful to try to save what we can, but there must always be an effort to tear those systems down and build something that is more, that cares for people.
Change only happens when people see it in their self-interest to change. Full stop. So if you can market that inside, and I think some people do it well, go for it. I think the inside needs the pressure from the outside, the skillful pressure that understands opportunity, seizes opportunity, but sees realistic, pragmatic steps forward as mini successes. Right now, I believe we have a confluence of circumstances that provides a great opportunity for major change in structures. It's because of a couple of things. One, what are we going to do post-COVID? Everyone is concerned with that. COVID, the pandemic, has been the greatest leveler of all time, because whether you are wealthy and on Wall Street or poor and in the communities that I know so well in the isolated North, your concern is for the same thing: survival, well-being, a future for your children, the ability to breathe. And so we need to capitalize on that right now. At the same time, young people all across the globe are questioning generations older than them on the basis of climate change. What has generations done to prepare a future? So when you get fear, when you get challenging, questioning, great levelers, and then you get events, such as the George Floyd event, which the reaction, it's visceral. It has shaken people to their foundations.
It's also really important when we talk about George Floyd that we recognize that was a man who was murdered. It wasn't an event, it was the murder of a Black man by our state. So I just want to make sure when we say it that we're being very clear, because
absolutely, it was a murder.
On around that.
All of this I see as elements of setting the stage to craft a bold and courageous future. So I'm a pragmatist. I've seen all my life, I've seen myself as a channel between the inside and the outside. I'm a mediator by nature and by culture. And I can see the values of all the forces around the table, but the timing has to be right. You can't craft a solution for the future with everyone involved unless they're motivated to do it and see it in their self-interest. Right here, right now is the time. It's in people's self-interest to work together, or we're not going to survive in a healthy way for the future.
The insights that Roberta shared with us, one relates to a parable, which may or may not be true, between Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson. He did, with intensity, go to the institutions, including the White House. Lyndon Johnson is said to have said, "Make me do it." You need the outside to make me do it on the inside. Even if it's right, there's resistance. I need your help from the outside.
Right.
Suspend your cynicism. Take this crazy political system where I always say we've now commodified social design, where money and power and corporate strength govern rather than representation of people conferring legitimacy onto a market system. We're in a place now where the fuel in the fire is huge, and it's time to act. It's not time to think about acting, it's time to act.
Let me just bring into the conversation one thing that you said, Roberta. You were a pragmatist, and there are, of course, people who believe themselves to be more idealists, and some others who believe to be more pragmatist. Whereas, as Rob said, you always need somebody from the inside to produce change, because change also happens, or mostly happens, within formal institutions. So you need somebody to open the door and to help and to get and to open the door for a movement to produce change. At least that's how marriage equality was achieved in Mexico. It was pushed by LGBT activists from outside of the system, but it was produced by a door that opened in Mexico City's Congress by some public officials, by some legislators who were elected just like you, Serpil, who is working within the system, and who I believe that you also position yourself as an agent of change, as a pragmatist. And what's next? Once you're in power, how do you help? How do you open the door to the movements that are actually pushing for it?
Yes, this is. I think this is really my job, to be a role model for other communities, for other migrants, for girls, for example, and they see me. It can be works in Germany to get this position that I have now. In Germany, it's not so. It's a low threshold to get in the party and make so the change in the system. I don't know how it is in Mexico or in other countries, but in Germany it's not so hard to get in the party, and it's if you are the first, it's not so easy. I'd say it. You have a strong way and you work harder, and so I want to help and I want to empower other groups to take the way or come in the debate with us, and I think it's became better solution then if we are in our way we make politics to get the best solution. And we need all the communities and all the people in the community to get good solutions. And we see it in that pandemic. Roberta says it's if you're poor or rich, old, young, woman, or like we all need us to get good solutions, and I think this can be the way. And this is I think I said I want to be a part of the solution.
And John, I know that you always look at the previous activists, at the previous generations, at the previous advocates that are building activism. What do you think we can learn from those, specifically for the people who were protesting in 2012, 15, 17, for what we're facing today?
I think that it's important to recognize that what we're seeing right now in the United States around the Black liberation movement is really two generations of activists coming together. In this internet age, our generations of activism are very short. So we have the 2012 through 2015 generation of activists who are now tutoring younger generations in this particular moment. And that is important because we had the systemic incarceration of activists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that really locked us away from that intergenerational knowledge in many important ways. And so the ability to build these structures and keep going are important for a couple of things. One, because of course, the things that we're asking for, we do not get overnight. And it is important that when these moments come and people are out in the streets, that we already have a platform that we're speaking to, that we know exactly what changes we want to see. But I think it's also important to recognize about this particular generation and what we've learned from the past is through our embracing of intersectionality, which of course was coined by the great Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, the idea that we do not leave people behind. We talk a lot about pragmatism, but it's important to recognize that pragmatism is often carried out on the backs of the most marginalized of our populations. And we find that even when we make progress, that often people who are more marginalized within populations we aim to serve are left behind or even further harmed than they were before. This generation of activism demands different, demands better. It demands that all of the solutions we put forward are not leaving disabled people, queer people, women of color behind, that we are pulling everyone forward with us. And I think that that is really hopeful, and it's something that I hope we continue to embrace. It can seem divisive, it can seem slow, it can seem impractical. But the truth is that when we bake oppression into our movements in the name of pragmatism, we end up becoming oppressors. And that is not what I think anyone doing this work wants to be. And where we can look at past generations and see the absolute amazing work, the care, the thought, we should also look to who was shut out of those past movements, who was erased, and say, what can we do to make sure that we are honoring everyone's work, everyone's sacrifice right now as it's happening, so that we don't end up being those cautionary tales in our history books, and so that our solutions are truly effective. And I really believe that intersectionality, dreaming big, and recognizing that fundamentally, we cannot move forward without saying everyone deserves liberty. Everyone deserves to thrive in our society. And we will not compromise the lives of our most marginalized people in the name of progress.
Sure. Roberta, what do you think of this? The fact that that Ijoma is talking about intersectionality, which is actually one of the goals of any movement in order to be successful, in order to discuss all the different oppressions that a person or a group or a collective can face, and also about the idea of what this new generation of activists is pushing forward. You were talking previously about 7 generations of First Nations activists who push for change and who produce change. But now we're seeing a new wave of activists everywhere in the world pushing for what Ijoma just mentioned. What do you think of it?
Intersectionality is absolutely vital in all of our approaches. I was on the first Gender Equality Advisory Council to the G7 Summit a couple of years ago, and Canada was the host. I'm glad to see it's continued. And we insisted that any discussions, and we were successful in getting discussions, the first time to discuss a consideration of gender, and beyond that, intersectionality. That is absolutely essential. I also think, though, and this is controversial, this is sensitive, we need to hold up mirrors to our own communities, in our own communities, on these topics of intersectionality. Because in some of our communities, we've learned well the lessons of the oppressor. And we are part often of keeping these systems going. Why? Because we got let in the door. And so we need to be brutally honest. When I say I'm pragmatic, I'm concrete. I know what change is, and I know it's achievable, but not the whole globe is not going to change tomorrow. Am I driving for that? You bet I am. But will I identify small wins and take them as a way of fueling greater energy for progress? Oh, yes, I will. Because that is the way you keep people, my experience tells me, the way you keep people focused on the end goal is for them to know that we're making progress towards it. Right now, I think we're well positioned to make leaps towards it. And if we're not careful, though, this is the pragmatic part of it. We'll fall off the table because fear produces an opportunity for catapulting forward and also withdrawing to what's comfortable, as was said earlier. And we need to make sure we keep that door wide open, or else it will slam shut. And that's why we need the inside of Circle, we need the outside of Idioma, we need everybody as part of any change movement. But structural change is possible in our lifetime. I have no doubt about it.
Rob, do you agree with this and concrete tactics to produce that change, examples that you can share with others? And also, what have you learned from this conversation?
I think that the frustration, the anger, the hostility towards this unjust system is justified. But I worry that hatred, and I Rachel Dodson and my wife Alexis McGill Johnson, who founded a mind science of racial healing business called perception.org, that hate promotes hate. And I don't necessarily believe that elites are going to change, but we have to act as though they could. Franklin Roosevelt was considered a silver spoon in the mouth, entitled, not very imaginative man. A lot of people would say similar things about Joe Biden. But Franklin Roosevelt did assemble people like Rexford Tugwell, like Jesse Jones, who produced institutional transformation once they got their hands of power, and Franklin Roosevelt rose to the occasion. I think that we are in a period where all kinds of secular religions have died. The notion of the free market, the notion of the American dream and opportunity being pervasively available to everyone. There's a very controversial man from the 1950s named R.C. Zaner. He was very controversial in the Middle East. But he wrote that the loss of faith in a given religion does not by any means imply the eradication of the religious instinct. It merely means the instinct temporarily repressed will seek an object elsewhere. The object elsewhere is a better vision of a society. And all of these people who've been hurt, all of these people who've been abused, have the sensitivity to be the designers. I go back to where I started. Dr. Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph, they didn't create a budget to take care of Black oppressed people. They created the Freedom Budget for All Americans, which was designed to enlist and inspire a better design of the fiscal uses of the United States budget than the Vietnam War and the neglect of urban areas and other things. I think that Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi both illustrate to us, in this time of great hostility, frustration, and dysfunction, the pathway forward for the leadership that creates that object of inspiration, that design for society. And I think that hatred gets in the way of that.
Can we also, though, be careful that when we're talking about historical figures, we talk about really who they were as whole people? Because when we talk about Roosevelt, we have to talk about the extreme racism with which he practiced and the theft of native lands, the decimation of buffalo population that he is largely responsible for. And so a lot of times we celebrate these heroes because they have power, because they're white men. But like I said before, on the backs of many marginalized people, these things were carried out. And when we look at the devastation that the Roosevelt administration meant to Native people in this country, you know, it's hard for me to look at him and say, oh, he was a part of progress, because he was a part of progress for certain populations, for powerful populations, but certainly not for communities of color in this country.
Yeah, and also for Asian community, there were internment of Japanese Americans during World War II as well. Circle, the same question goes for you. What kind of strategies and tactics would you push for? We know now that you're in Parliament, but once let's imagine that you're not in Parliament. What strategies or tactics would you try to push in order to get change? And also, if you're optimistic about what's coming next in the world that comes after this pandemic and all these problems that we're facing now.
Well, I see that most of the young and famous people from Fridays for Future, we have next year election in Germany, and they run to the elections. I don't know if it is in USA too. Perhaps well, we can say it, the activists in America goes and run to the parliament too, or they say no, we want to be activists outside the parliament. I see in Germany that most of them want to use the organization, want to use the parties to make the change in the parliament.
Ijoma, let's go back to you. Let's kind of imagine the opposite. Are you running for office?
No,
or what tactics do you prefer?
Obvious, but that I have no intention of working within our systems anytime soon. You know, I honestly, I do believe and I appreciate the people who take on the very difficult work of working within our systems. These systems exist, and as much as I would love to see them disappear, and I would absolutely love to see them all torn to the ground and replaced with something better. I recognize that right now they are impacting the lives of people around the world, and therefore there are people who have to work within them. It will always be my job to be outside of those systems and pointing out that our goal does not lie within these systems, and that we have to continuously push for something better. You know, I want people to recognize this. All of these systems are human-made. Right? All of these systems were made by people who are no better or smarter than us. And that means that we can imagine something better. We have to recognize the ways in which we've been duped and the ways in which all of us, regardless of race or gender or sexual orientation, are being harmed by this system. The way in which we are benefiting is a lie that we've been sold. It's the lie that if you play out your part, you will benefit in ways other people do not. Well, without recognizing, of course, that most of the benefits of these systems have already been siphoned up to major corporations, you know, to the uber elite and wealthy, and we're really fighting for scraps. And until we recognize that, the lies around race, gender, sexuality, and class that have been told us in order to make us play a part in this exploitative system, we're going to, you know, continuously fight each other on this. So we have to recognize this, but we have to pay attention, of course, to historically how we've been tied to stories around racism, around sexism, around ableism in order to play these parts so we can dismantle it. But I do appreciate people within the systems, but I will always be critiquing them. I look forward to protesting all of our progressive leaders and saying they can do better, because that's the only way we do better is by continuously saying, don't get tied to these systems. You are still accountable to us. We have a bigger vision for change than what may be available right now.
We're actually now in the final part of this conversation, so we'll give each one of you a couple of minutes just to give us your final thoughts, if you didn't get the chance to interject, and also asking you if your minds or perspectives are changing in this crisis and in which way. So I'll start with you, Rob.
Well, I think that in this crisis, we do need a change in the composition of leadership, more women, more people of color, more sensitivity to the breadth of humanity, more indigenous people, Native Americans, they call in the United States. The second thing we need is to derail the role of money in politics because it thwarts sensitive representation. Those systemic changes, along with voter suppression, gerrymandering in the United States, are attempts to, it's not even otherness, it's attempts to make ineffective human beings in the collective design of our society. And we've got to go beyond personality. I think Donald Trump does a lot of hideous things. But do we scrutinize previous administration, of which our Democratic nominee was the vice president, and wonder if they weren't the co-authors of the despair that led to Donald Trump by playing an inside institutional game? So I think it's changing the incentives, and it's changing the people who are the visionaries and the designers.
Roberta, your final thoughts on this conversation, something you might want to add up, and how has your mind and perspective changed throughout 2020?
Well, first of all, Rob's given me a list of books to go back and read and reread and discover. Thank you for that. Any Joma. 2020 has been a very difficult, challenging year, I would say, for everyone. Joma talks about the murder of George Floyd. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls is something, and men in Canada and amongst Indigenous people around the world is not new. What is new is the reaction, the response that we're seeing right now that has really galvanized the world. And I think that presents in that tragedy the opportunity. Our people, let me share as a final thought some of our beliefs. We believe in the importance of keeping a good mind in everything we do. Keep a good mind, be constructive, build, find opportunity, take it where you find it, and make something positive out of it. We see our world, ourselves in relationship to one another and to the environment around us. And we look for ways of building a future where we can focus on the things that we have in common. And I think these are the kinds of responsibilities to the collective, and I mean beyond my nation and beyond my people, but all people. We have a responsibility, not just to our family, our employer and so on, but to all humankind, and to find ways of building on that responsibility. I think we've lost the collective in a lot of our thinking around the world. We're very focused on individual rights. And while they're important, if we don't have a collective survival, we don't have an opportunity to express ourselves as individuals or to have those rights. So I think as I look forward to the post-COVID-19 time, I am hopeful, I am determined, I am looking for ways of reaching out to other people to create a new tomorrow, one with new structures that are devoted to building trust and holding all of us accountable for the future we're building for the seventh generation.
Circle, your final thoughts and anything you want to add up to the conversation, and how has your mind changed throughout 2020?
Now the place in my party to can make decisions for all the people in Germany, because we are now in the coalition in Berlin. We have for the children in Germany a bonus for €300 to give them in the crisis, because we see that families need help in the crisis. We do that now, and I know, or I see that I can be a part of them and make good solutions for the kids or for the families or for the communities. And it is very important to make many perspectives in politics to give them. And so I think I can do it now, and I help other people in the communities to grow up in the parties or be a role model for them. And I hope I can help them or make a good way for the other people. But I think that it's my part now. I can do it.
Ijoma, your final thoughts on this conversation, something that you might want to add up to the conversation, and how has your mind, your perspective, your empathy changed throughout this year?
You know, this has been an incredibly tough year, especially to be, I would say, a Black American, to be facing the double blows of disproportionate impact from this pandemic, while also still facing steady, if not increasing state violence, has been incredibly difficult. But what has been keeping me going, honestly, is seeing the energy of our young protesters and watching, them say still generation after generation that they believe that we can create change. And if their whole lives have been defined by these moments, I think about people who were coming of age, young Black people coming of age as Trayvon Martin was murdered, coming of age as Mike Brown was murdered, and they still believe we can have change, then who are we to say that we can't? Who are we to dishonor that activism and that hope with pessimism? We have to fight. We have to fight like every Black life matters. We have to fight like the life of every marginalized person in our society is vital to our success as not only a country, but as a world. And so I want people to look at that, to look at generations of activism and find hope and find their peace and say, this is where I touch this system. This is what's happening in my town, in my neighborhood. Know what's happening. Know what's happening in your schools, know what's happening in your cities, know who's making money and who isn't, who's being locked away, who's being harmed, and pick a spot to get to work. Say, I have access here. I can go to this city council meeting here. I can have these meetings at work here. I can show up with friends at these protests, but do something. Honor us. Honor our sacrifice. Honor our fight. Honor our faith that honestly the world is lucky to have, because it's been over 400 years that we've been fighting this system, and we're still here saying it can be done.
Well, thank you so much to you, Serpil. Thank you so much to you, Ijoma. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Roberta. Thank you so much for 6 Degrees for the invitation, for being with you this year. It's been quite a privilege to have this conversation with all of you. I learned a lot. And to all the people who follow us, who have lost a loved one throughout this pandemic, our hearts are with you. We will get through this. I'm pretty sure about it. We will get through this, and we will be and try to construct and to build a better place for all of us. We all deserve to be in a world in which racial inequality is gone, a world in which gender inequality is gone, a world in which the divisions between the rich and the poor are deconstructed, and we can have a more justice world, and a world in which there are no walls, but bridges that connect us all. Thank you very much for the invitation to 6 Degrees, and thank you all for following this conversation. Keep up with the rest of the program of that 6 Degrees has for all of us. Thank you.